Good afternoon, everyone. I'm tempted to say good morning because this is a Saturday, but it is afternoon. So thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us to hear about entitlement spending on the federal level and state pensions. My name is Romina Boccia. I'm here with the Heritage Foundation. I'm the Grover M. Herman Fellow in Federal Budgetary Affairs, and I focus on federal spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the biggest programs that are also driving the growth in the budget. I'm going to start off with a presentation, and then Scott Moody is going to follow on the state level, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for question and answer and any discussion that you'd all like to have. So the big challenge we have, and I'm trying to depict this here, is you have special interest groups that yield disproportionate influence in Congress. It tends to be the people who vote. Those are the people 55 and older. So if the budget reflects their political strength in the numbers. 51% of federal spending this year goes to Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and other smaller federal health care programs. Once you add in other transfer spending, unemployment insurance, veterans benefits, federal pensions and retirement benefits, you end up with 70% of the federal budget in 2015 going to what are considered transfer programs. So that means tax money comes in, bureaucrats siphon off a bit to do what they're doing, and then it goes out to other people. So you're left with about 1/3 of the budget to do the things that we think of as a role of the federal government, and then a lot of other stuff that the federal government shouldn't be doing to begin with. The defense budget only makes up about 18% of the budget, and its share keeps shrinking. In fact, we're already below the average historical level, and we're about to hit half of the average historical level. Over the past 50 years, defense has been about 5% of GDP in terms of spending, and we're at about 3% now, and we're heading to 2.3% under the president's budget. So as entitlements are expanding, defense is shrinking. The budget overall is growing. What this chart tries to depict very clearly is that any discussion you hear that, oh, if we're really serious about addressing the national debt, all we need to do is just raise revenue. Well, the problem is not a shortfall in revenue. It is very clear, and this is data from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan congressional scorekeeper. It's very clear here that what's driving the deficit and therefore the debt is spending that is growing massively. This chart, you can see, very much aligns with the one you just saw, because what's driving the growth in spending over the next decade and beyond are these entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, Obamacare now. In fact, Obamacare is the largest driver of spending growth over the next decade. 44% of the growth in entitlement spending comes from Obamacare over the next decade. This is a new entitlement, so as the spending on it is ramping up, it's driving the growth. That red line depicts projected revenues over that period between now and 2040 and what it's been historically. And what's really scary about this picture is that by 2030, these programs and interest on the debt, which is growing as the debt is growing, are projected to consume all tax revenues. So you're either looking at massively raising taxes beyond what the American people have indicated to the Congress over a long period of fluctuating tax rates, what they're willing to part with in order to finance government, or you have to tremendously reduce spending on these programs. This is just another way of depicting how the budget is split up right now. Defense at 18%, and then the domestic programs make up the other portion of that 1/3. But it's very clear that welfare and entitlement programs are the biggest part of the budget. When you poll people and ask them, would you like to reduce government spending? Overwhelmingly, people say yes. They get that spending is too high, they want to cut spending, but when you get more specific and you ask, well, what do you think we can cut? the number one area that people will mention is foreign aid. Foreign aid, compared to mandatory entitlement spending, tiny. You can't balance the budget by cutting foreign aid. We have to get control over these programs that are growing massively. So what I've shown you so far has looked at where we're heading in the future. Well, have things been any different? Is this a new scenario? Unfortunately, over the past 40 years, the entire growth in total government spending has been a result of the growth in entitlement spending. In fact, entitlement spending is that second bar there, where you have healthcare, retirement, and welfare spending. You see that it is larger than the overall growth in government spending, which is compared to the left of it. So what has fallen? Defense. Defense spending, our core national constitutional priority for the federal government, is shrinking, and the government is more and more becoming a welfare, healthcare, and a retirement company, and doing much less of what the federal government was set up to do. This is very concerning. So as spending is going up, it's reflected in the deficit and the debt. This is only looking at the debt borrowed in credit markets. About half of this debt belongs to foreign countries, China, Japan, European nations. The other half is held domestically by mutual funds, pension funds, individuals. Anybody who buys treasury securities or holds any kind of government bond fund, they own a portion of this debt. But since the recession, actually, the largest share of the increase in the debt has gone to the Fed. The Fed has bought up about $4 trillion in government debt. And what that means is that that's the way in which the Fed created money to try and boost economic growth. We've never been in this situation where the Fed has had such an expansive portfolio. We don't know what's going to happen when the Fed tries to unravel it. We're living in very volatile times, and the federal government certainly isn't in a position to address that, because our debt level is already about as high as it was after World War II, and at the time the United States was fighting a two-front war, and debt was actually on the downtrend. After the war, debt was falling. Now debt is rising because of structural spending challenges, so we're in a very different situation entirely. The debt is not only too high, but it's also growing. $17 trillion is, well, it's actually 18 now, so I do need to update that chart. The debt is growing faster than my PowerPoint. So what this chart depicts is 18 trillion is what the federal government reports as what's been borrowed in credit markets. That's 12 trillion, and then the rest is intergovernmental borrowing. So the biggest share of that is Social Security. Over the past 30 years, Social Security has collected more in payroll taxes than was necessary to fund benefits. But the federal government, because it didn't save the money, it actually just spent it. So it fueled the growth in government over the past 3 decades. And now, in order to pay those benefits, because payroll taxes are actually short now of what we have to pay to current beneficiaries, we have to find the money elsewhere. And today, unfortunately, that looks like borrowing more money. Last year, the federal government had to borrow $70 billion to fund Social Security benefits in excess of current payroll taxes. And that number is rising to $350 billion before the trust fund is expected to run out. So that is a big drain on the budget. What you see below there, 205 trillion, that's a number that economist Lawrence Kotlikoff calculated. And what he's looking at is not just the current debt that the government is measuring, but let's look at how a company accounts for its future liabilities. What are all the obligations that we've committed to, and what's that shortfall there? So this is looking at what the government is expected to spend compared to what it's taking in through taxes, through the infinite horizon, and that liability is $200 trillion today. To put that in terms that maybe we can all better understand is, if we wanted to make sure that we had the money available to pay all those unfunded obligations, that we didn't need to raise taxes, that we didn't need to change any of those obligations, cut spending in those areas, we would have to set aside $200 trillion today to make sure that money is available. And the big issue there is that many of the programs that are driving the growth in spending, namely the entitlement programs, have been set up in a way that they were underfunded from the get-go. We knew that demographic changes got us to a point where there are now many more retirees than people who are funding their benefits than used to be the case in the past. And so what you're ending up doing is you create this intergenerational wealth transfer from younger working generations to older retired generations. And people have been told that they have paid for their own benefits. And so rightfully they feel entitled to them. Unfortunately, they haven't paid as much as they're getting back. In fact, Medicare is only about 15% funded by the payroll tax and 85% funded by general revenue transfers. So people have been told one story. The truth is very different, and our generation has to deal with it now. This is just what has happened demographically. In the 1950s, Medicare and Medicaid didn't exist yet. They were just being thought up and then created. Social Security existed since 1934, but at the time you had 16 workers for every beneficiary of the Social Security program. As the government has added more programs that more people can benefit from, today we're at 3 to 1, 3 workers paying for every one retiree, and over the next 20 years we'll be down to 2 to 1. So that's the fundamental challenge that we're facing. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the solutions that my colleagues and I at Heritage have come up with to address this challenge. And then I don't want to take too much time so that we can hear a little bit about what's happening on the state level, which also affects all of you. There's a number of policy tools that the federal government has available to address its spending challenge. The most important one, I would argue, is to deal with healthcare costs, because Medicare is the fastest growing government program. It has massive unfunded liabilities, and it also creates great distortion in the healthcare market. The way in which it's managed has increased the cost of healthcare, and now we have Obamacare that is making the situation worse. So the most important thing that Congress can do is to adopt a market-based, patient-centered healthcare system that has price signal mechanisms, that lowers costs, because it's not always about reducing what's available to people when they go to see their doctor, but how much are we paying for that? And we're paying too much for it. And every year the government reports its improper payments. So that means paying for things that were never received, paying benefits to people that weren't eligible, waste, fraud, those kinds of things. Last year it was over $100 billion, and the largest share of those improper payments comes from federal health care programs. The federal government is not in a position to act as a good steward of taxpayer dollars, to act as an effective healthcare insurance company. The government was never set up to do that, and it does that very poorly. So Medicare premium support that focuses benefits on those who truly need them, and that brings in market competition to drive up innovation in the healthcare market and reduce costs, is the most important thing we can do. But we also have to look at cutting other mandatory spending, and that's looking at how generous retirement benefits are, because they truly drive the growth. But in order to have the moral authority to do that, we should not shy away from eliminating bad government spending that only benefits special interests at the expense of the public. So we ought to cut discretionary spending on the domestic side. There are plenty of programs that Congress should get rid of, but the budget process has all but fallen apart. So we need to think about other tools to help Congress do that. And one of the proposals we have for that is to establish a dedicated spending commission. I'm just going to skip forward to get to that part. So there's a good historical example we have when special interests drive budget decisions, and that is After the Cold War, the US found itself with a number of obsolete military bases. They were draining the defense budget, they were no longer needed, but Congress was not able to close these bases because they brought certain benefits to certain districts, and those members of Congress would fight very hard to keep those benefits in their districts. So what Congress ended up doing is it set up an objective third-party commission, the BRAC Commission, to identify those military bases that no longer serve the national interest and bundle them together in one package with expedited legislative action. So the Congress had to vote on, are we going to get rid of obsolete bases that by objective criteria have been identified not to serve the national interest, they're just costing us money, or are we going to keep them because, you know, parochial interests? And that commission succeeded at closing a number of these obsolete military bases, and in fact, many of those districts are flourishing today. The military did a very good job reporting on what happened to those bases that were closed. And what happened is that private sector companies went in, they used those facilities, people got jobs in those new companies, and those areas actually flourished. So it's not all a lose-lose situation. In fact, we can create win-win situations with these kinds of proposals. So what we're proposing is do something like that for domestic agencies and programs. The Government Accountability Office tells Congress every year about all the duplication, about all the improper spending, which according to then Senator Tom Coburn amounts to about $200 billion a year. That's a lot of money that Congress is not cutting because there's very little glory in eliminating a bad program. How much nicer is it to put out a press release and say, we established a new program? So in order to help Congress do that, a commission like the BRAC Commission could be very successful, and I'm hopeful that we will see something like this in the next year or two because Representative McCarthy actually mentioned support for a commission like this recently to Politico. So thank you for your attention this afternoon, and with that I'd like to hand things over to Scott to talk to us a little bit about what's happening on the state level.
Thank you, Romina. It's always tough following a federal presentation when you've got numbers in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. When you start talking about state, it's a little bit lower, but at the same time, it brings up some important federalism issues, which I'm going to talk about in my presentation today. My name's Scott Moody. I'm CEO and resident dismal scientist at State Budget Solutions. We focus on state budget reform issues, especially with pensions, which is primary focus today. First, we need to talk about exactly how big is the state pension system problem. Unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, the pension burden has been significantly underestimated. As part of the special interest that Romina was talking about, it was in everybody's own interest to sort of kick the can down the road, just as the federal government's been doing with their programs, state government's been doing with their pension system. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details into how the pension system has been accomplishing kicking the can down the road, but in general, it all revolves around the assumed rate of return on investment. And ironically, they've been assuming a very high rate of return, 8.5%, but the ironic thing about that is they completely ignore the risk level that it takes to achieve such high returns. I mean, why stop at 8.5%? Why not 10%, 20, 100%? You could make the problem disappear. Well, the problem is risk, of course, and we all know that. The greater returns you get, the higher the risk, and therefore the higher that you might not get anything out of that, out of the gamble that you're taking in your investment returns. So they conveniently sort of swept risk under the rug. Well, economists come along and said, well, brought the risk boogeyman back out and said, no, wait a minute, you should be assuming a much lower rate of return, roughly currently in a 2.5% to 3.5% range, which is what currently government securities like treasuries trade for. Why? Because treasuries are assumed to be risk-free. If, of course, you believe that Uncle Sam can't go bankrupt. I don't know after the last presentation that that's true or not. Nonetheless, at that much lower rate of return, the pension burden balloons dramatically. Now, at State Budget Solutions, and we release a report annually that quantifies the pension burden using what's called a fair market value rate, which is the lower 2.5% to 3.5%. And what you find is, number one, to understand how the pension burden works, you first have to quantify how much in assets they own. So currently, assets that all the states cumulatively have is valued roughly at $2.7 trillion. However, the liabilities, the pensions to be paid out in the future, are worth $7.4 trillion. So that leaves an unfunded pension gap of $4.7 trillion, which is up from $4.1 trillion in 2013. Problem with that is, as you can imagine, you start connecting that dot between 4.1 and 4.7 and projecting it on into the future, and you start getting Romina's charts going out to 2030, and you get very, very large unfunded liabilities in the pension systems. Now, of course, we're talking about the 50 states, so not every state is quite as bad off as others. When you look at it in total, the total unfunded states with the largest unfunded amounts, you'll see, of course, the very large states dominate this chart. California with $754 billion unfunded liability, Illinois, $332 billion, New York, $307 billion, and so on down the list. You can see that's pretty much ranked by the size of the state. So that's not very informative. What we want to look at is, well, how badly funded are they? Again, this goes back, the funding ratio is the ratio of assets to liabilities. You can see Illinois is only 22% funded. That means right now they only have 22% of the assets necessary to pay their future unfunded liabilities. They are currently the worst in the country. Overall, the cumulative state for all the states is about 1/3. So you can see that 20% is more likely to be the case than anything beyond it. Wisconsin has the highest, and it's in the 60s. Another way to look at the liability is the liability on a per-person basis. And there you get a slightly different view. Alaska has the highest at $40,000 per every man, woman, and child in that state, so that's quite a burden. Of course, Illinois shows up again, Ohio, Connecticut, and so on. Now I want to draw your attention to Illinois, because I'm gonna focus my remarks a little bit towards that state, because as you can see, that's the one that shows up in the top three in all three of those charts, and they're sort of the first state that's really hit the rocks, if you will. They recently increased their individual income tax a couple of years ago from 3% to 5%, which on a percentage basis is a huge increase, simply to pay their annual requirement to their pension system. And as you can see, it's still not getting any better. The real problem, I think, that the unfunded pension liability poses is, well, of course, number one, states may face bankruptcy. Cities are already facing bankruptcy over their pension issue. But I think we need to take a step back and look at a bigger problem, which is the possibility of a federal bailout. Of course, we all know bailouts have sort of become the de jour of the day with the federal government bailing out auto companies, financial companies. Might the states be next to line up for a bailout? Well, back in 2002, then Governor Pat Quinn, who fortunately is no longer governor, proposed that the federal government guarantee the state's pension debt. Just to give you a little background, Illinois not only has not been making their payment to their pension system as required, they also have been taking out what's called pension obligation bonds, which basically means taking out a bond and putting that money into their pension system. Well, wouldn't it be great if Uncle Sam paid the interest on those bonds? That's basically was the scheme that Governor Quinn wanted to propose, because he obviously wanted to propose more bonds so that he wouldn't have to make his payment. And, of course, with the federal guarantee, interest payments in general would be lower. What's happening in Illinois now is they're encountering this vicious cycle where their pension burden is now affecting their overall credit rating, which means borrowing for anything is now the price is going up, whether it's for roads or education, it doesn't matter. All their costs are going up. So it's this vicious cycle. If they don't fix their pension system, their overall credit rating is going to continue to deteriorate. They already have the worst credit rating currently in the country. So the Illinois Policy Institute at that time, once he made his proposal, decided to fight back. Now, the Illinois Policy Institute is the state's free market think tank and is a member of the State Policy Network. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a network where all 50 states have a free market think tank. And they launched a website called NoPensionBailout.com. It's still live. You can check it out after the presentation today. I helped them actually create the model that they use on that website, which was to look at basically the winners and losers of a potential bailout. Because think about what are you essentially doing with a federal bailout? You're going to reward the most big spending states, and you're going to penalize the states that actually were responsible. And so, as we all know, the federal system is basically a massive redistribution system between the states. Some states win, some states lose. So we decided to apply that to a potential bailout. And with this map, you can see clearly what the results were of our simulation. And you can see, of course, Illinois is a big winner. New Jersey, which is also very indebted, is a big winner. California, all of those states that we just talked about in those lists are the big winners. The states in red are the big losers. They're the ones who are going to end up paying more in taxes because of a bailout than they're going to receive in a potential bailout situation. Now, one of the interesting things about their website is we included a dynamic analysis because we don't know in the future what a bailout may actually look like. We hope we don't ever have to encounter that situation. But if we do, you can go to this website one day and plug in the various scenarios for which taxes are going to go up, which spending might be cut, how much of a bailout we're talking about, and you can estimate your own map, basically. And at the bottom there, you can see you can view it at the state level. We also did it all the way down to the county level. So you can actually see how your county would benefit in this equation as well. So the big threat here is to federalism as we know it. Unfortunately, this current relationship to states to the federal government is already very, very dismal, right? I mean, the states are basically vassals of the federal government. Just look at we touched lightly on Obamacare's Medicaid expansion already, and we're seeing close to the majority of states accepting Obamacare Medicaid funds, which are going to further make states more dependent on federal largesse. Of course, the federal government can't afford it either. The difference is that the federal government can print money, as we discussed, and that printing money flows to the states in the form of Medicaid payments. But what kind of damage to federalism would a federal bailout further impose if that scenario were to come to pass? Because now you're talking about undoing a mistake that's been decades in the making from at the state level, suddenly coming and with their hat in their hand saying, I made this mistake, can you please help me with it? So I think that's a major issue that we need to talk more about as we move forward, and hopefully we can stop Obamacare's Medicaid expansion as well. So with that, I think I would like to open it up for questions. Do these mic works?
I think, yes, we can make them work.
So
yeah,
just sit
yeah.
down.
So any questions on the federal or state presentation, or any thoughts you have based on what you'd heard today? We can have a more open discussion as well, since there are only so many of us here. So if there's anything on your mind, please.
In 2005, when President Bush was proposing reforming Social Security by introducing personal accounts and transferring from a pay-as-you-go system,
You don't have one.
the problem was the spending gap was worse, and then double payments for the first couple of years. And given the other fiscal situation in the country, they couldn't afford for that double gap. So it appears that a lot of ways we're making governments
So at the time when that proposal came up, there was actually still a surplus in terms of how much money was coming into the Social Security system through the payroll tax versus how much was going out. And for those who might not know this, the payroll tax collected from workers today pays the benefits for current beneficiaries. Anything that was collected in the past was spent. So you had some of that surplus money that could go towards helping to pay for the transition. The one thing you want to keep in mind is that once you move over to a defined contribution system, you vastly improve your future long-term liabilities. And so it is worthwhile doing. But then you have to think about how to do it. The big problem you run into is if you want to grandfather everyone who's currently in the system or those 55 and older, which is what the proposal was at the time. Well, actually, if you do some benefit reductions, if you try to slow the growth in benefits, which are a result of an inflated COLA being used today, you could do something like that. You could improve progressivity, say, let's focus benefits on those who need them the most. And you can be very generous with that and say, if you have $200,000 in annual income plus your Social Security benefit, maybe we should have a discussion whether that makes sense for a federal program to fund benefits for people who are doing fairly well on their own. Because we really ought to have a system where you have more private control of your own retirement savings, and taxpayers aren't called on to unnecessarily support the retirement of others. So you'd have to look at a specific plan. If you phase it in for younger individuals and say, and you reduce their demands on what they can claim from the current system, or you just take them out of it completely, then you don't have transition costs. It's only if you're trying to get people who are currently in the system and try to incentivize them to switch over to the other one. The big issue, of course, you have that politically it's very difficult to do. People really like this idea of a defined benefit that's guaranteed for life. And so we have to be sensitive to that. In order to get around the problem, the Heritage Foundation has proposed to implement a flat benefit that secures that guarantee of lifetime income, but that does it in a more affordable way. So it's focused on those individuals who need it the most. And then it phases in a auto-enrollment plan for lower income and middle income individuals who might not otherwise save for their own retirement to supplement that federal flat benefit. And of course, once people start saving in the private sector, they get much greater returns. So that's a way of trying to get around the problem. You address both the benefit side and you establish private accounts as a complement. I think that applies on both the federal and state level.
Okay. Well, I think Romina touched on some of that in that the number of voters now in the over 55 category is only going to get bigger, and that's going to pose a political problem. But at the state level, it's also a union problem. I mean, it's the unions who have been bankrolling politicians who then promise the unions that they're going to enact these benefit increases. And the thing about benefits at the state level is you can make these promises, and as a politician, you never probably have to worry about ever seeing the payment roll in. So it's the perfect, if you want to look at it that way, it's the perfect arrangement between unions and politicians. And as we know, despite the rhetoric from the left, if you look at political contributions by type, it's dominated by unions. The first 3, 4, or 5 are all union contributors. It's not big corporations. So to the extent, and I think this is exactly why you're seeing the new Illinois governor right now proposing right-to-work legislation at the county level. Of course, he can't get it through the legislature. They're never going to pass it, but he's in-running them in a sense by allowing counties to enact right to work. That actually came out of Tennessee, I believe. This is picking up steam where counties are going to have the ability to enact right to work. And that's sort of the first step. I mean, until you break this unholy alliance between union funding and politicians able to kick the can down the road, that is the political problem that we're facing on the government pension side.
Because this is fundamentally a political problem, if you look at other nations that have addressed those challenges, it usually happens in a crisis situation, and that's what we have to be most worried about, is that it's going to come at a time where we're going to have a major crisis, and that's going to be the impetus to try and address it. There was some indication that it could have happened earlier, which was during the financial crisis in 2011. The president put together the Fiscal Commission that I thought came up with a fairly reasonable proposal given the politics of the time. In fact, it was very heavy on the spending reduction, as it should be, because that's what is, of course, driving the debt. The president had no interest in shepherding this. You do need presidential leadership to make big-scale changes like that. The president wanted to implement Obamacare. And so the president's, in fact, made the entitlement spending challenge worse. And if Republicans managed to repeal Obamacare, it would put us in a better fiscal situation. But it's not enough, because we had a challenge even before Obamacare. So the good news is that on the healthcare side, which is also the biggest spending challenge, there are win-win solutions. The Congressional Budget Office identified that premium support, because of added competition in healthcare markets, would lower Medicare healthcare premiums for current seniors. Because as Medicare spending goes up, seniors' premiums go up along with that. So through premium support, you lower costs for the federal government and the seniors who benefit from the program. So there's some solutions like that that are being politically demonized, but I'm hopeful because they've been part of the House budget for several years now. So I think there's a lot of support in the Congress. Other than the Fiscal Commission, which the way it raised revenue was actually, I would say, in the right way, which is to eliminate special tax preferences that are fundamentally unfair. But the president didn't shepherd it, and in fact, there was very little Democratic support for the proposal. I think they like having we could fix this issue if only Republicans agreed to tax increases. I think they like that as a talking point to say that Republicans are being obstructionists, but there has never been a good, reasonable deal that would have actually solved the problem. I think we should be very careful to just capitulate and say the only way we're going to deal with this is to raise revenue. I'm from Europe, I'm from Germany initially, and the way that European countries get around the fact that you actually cannot raise enough revenue to fund all these programs through income taxes because people stop working. Or they leave, or they figure out creative ways to hide their money. So what do? They have a value-added tax. They have a consumption tax that's highly regressive, that affects low-income individuals the most, who tend to consume most of their income, and they have that on top of the income tax system. And if we don't get a handle on the entitlement spending challenge, until we get close to the point where entitlements and interest on the debt consume all tax revenues, I am very worried that what we're going to end up with is a tax system that's going to be twice as burdensome as the one today, which is what you have in Europe. Now, there are some ways of building some political momentum, like adopting an overall spending cap. If you look at the greatest success of the past few years has been the Budget Control Act at keeping spending down. Unfortunately, the cap only applies to the discretionary budget, so it hasn't helped in the other budget areas. If you implemented a sustainable spending cap across the entire federal budget, you would build the political pressure to reform these programs, because it would squeeze out spending in all other areas very quickly. And I think that another way of doing it is if you looked at, this is actually quite an interesting proposal that I came across just recently, and it was a Democrat, a moderate Democrat who proposed it, Bill White. He wrote a book called America's Fiscal Constitution. And his proposal is that we're not very conscious of what purposes we're actually borrowing for. Think if the American people, if the taxpayer had a better idea as to what spending do we finance from our taxes, and then what other spending is it that we're financing from borrowing, and start separating the budget into true priorities, and those we finance from taxes. And if there's not enough tax revenue, then we can talk about that. But I think that if you actually do perform that exercise, you find that a lot of the spending we're financing from borrowing is spending that shouldn't be on the federal level to begin with. So it has to do with returning more power to the states, but also responsibility to raise revenue for a lot of the programs that are currently being funded from the federal pot. You have about $550 billion in the annual budget, so about 16% of the budget. That's already bigger than this year's deficit. That is federal grants in aid to states. States should be raising that revenue. They should be controlling that program funding. Medicaid is the biggest one. So there's a lot of ways we can get a handle on the problem. I think a spending cap might do it, and then we can prioritize between tax revenue and borrowing.
Yeah, I just want to put an exclamation mark. I mean, we really need to kill the idea that higher taxes, higher tax rates are going to solve our problem, because just look where we've been since the Reagan tax reform in 1986 that dropped rates. We're right back now to pre-86 tax rates at the federal level. We've seen a lot of new revenue already come in, and we haven't seen any fixing of the entitlement problem whatsoever. So it has to come on the spending side. Yes, sir.
So with the bipartisan commission to a debt commission, wouldn't that just focus on three programs, Entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? So wouldn't it be like every other commission that's formed to kind of get those costs under control for those three programs alone?
Just want to make sure I understood the question. Was it that the Fiscal Commission only focused on those three programs? Yeah, so the BRAC Commission is a proposal to deal with wasteful spending in the domestic budget, getting rid of programs that don't work, like Head Start, where even the president's own administration has put out a report showing that it's ineffective. And 47 job training programs, most of them don't work. Let's identify the ones that do, and really this is not a federal priority, it should be done on the state level. But when it comes to the entitlement programs, you need to you ought to look at other changes. And I think what's really important is to recognize that people have had an expectation to receive certain benefits from those programs. We have to be sensitive to that. In fact, people have not saved as much on their own because of this expectation. So there's some cost that we'll probably have to swallow because they've been on the books for so long. But there are lots of ways in which we can make sure that those who need the benefits the most receive them. And instead of asking, because this is really the proposal to raise the cap or any tax increase proposal that has come from the president or his party has been to raise taxes on what the president considers to be the wealthy, which, by the way, a lot of these entities are actually small businesses. And it would directly cut into what they can put into their business and how many jobs they can create to tax them more. That if you reduce benefits for those on the upper end, doing additional means testing, making those programs more progressive, people say, well, that's not fair because I've saved all my life. But what the alternative is that you're going to pay higher taxes for it. So does it make more sense to funnel more of your money through the government so we can pay unnecessary benefits to individuals who don't really need them, who are likely saving them, or it allows them to not tap into their other retirement funds as much? Or to raise, or to actually say, no, you control more of your own retirement savings. We're going to focus benefits on those who truly need them. In fact, those were the original goals of these programs. Social Security was set up to protect against destitution in old age. Well, it does something very different. And in fact, there are people who have worked for 35 years and paid into the system, but because they worked low-income jobs, their benefits now are below the poverty level. And that's not right. So the program is not doing what it set out to do. It's doing something very different. Increasing the retirement age would be great because the program, most people didn't live to 65 when the program was established. Now most people do, and people live to 85 and longer. The longevity keeps going up. So indexing the retirement age to increases in life expectancy makes that automatic, and because the program has become more expensive over time because of all these changes. So we do have a plan out called Saving the American Dream, where we go into more detail into all these proposals, and it's available online as well. And if you want to talk more, I'd be happy to give you my card. I think we can take one more question. Thank you.
Regarding the state pensions, it shows the percentage of the funded that we actually paying off. Is there a percentage that's funded for the federal pensions?
Oh.
There are.
You?
But I'm not familiar with them.
So, so there's the civilian side, and the federal government's actually reformed its pension system for federal workers. So most of it is defined contribution now through what's called the TSP, the Thrift Savings Plan. So,
It's somewhat recent though, isn't it?
No, that was done in the 80s.
But are people collecting the traditional pension?
There's still people collecting a traditional pension, yes.
Is that funded 100%?
You know, I don't know. I'd be happy to look into that for you and get back to you. But it's relatively small compared to the civilian entitlements. Yeah. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll be sticking around if you want to chat further. I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you.